Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, and I want to know what got you into Sherlock Holmes. For me, it goes back to my childhood, my formative years, where I saw glimpses and references to Sherlock Holmes in popular culture and in media. That iconic silhouette of the deerstalker hat and the pipe as hanging out of the mouth of Sherlock Holmes himself. And all of this was before I even really recognized it, before I became cognizant of what he was, the detective character that he was. Most specifically, before I actually got into reading the canon, I would see references to Sherlock Holmes in Star Trek, of all things. Star Trek The Next Generation had a couple of episodes where the characters of Data and LaForge would go onto the holodeck of the Enterprise NCC 1701D and want to have sort of Sherlock Holmes adventures that they would play act in the holographic, surroundings. And but in one case, Data, because he was an android and has a positronic brain, very fastly paced, and he has the entire canon, in his memory banks, essentially, LaForge was kind of getting ticked off because they'd go in and he would be missing the point of the fun of this, trying to solve the mystery. Data already knew who the culprit was, who the villain or the criminal or whatever like that was, and would call it out almost immediately, ruining the experience for LaForge. So in this one particular, I think it was a two-parter, they programmed the holodeck computer to try to create an adversary on par, sort of intellectually with Data and all that kind of stuff. And there's some other things that happen that are involved. But it immediately directly picks out of the Sherlock Holmes canon Professor James Moriarty, the arch nemesis of Sherlock Holmes, and imbues him with this super intelligence, thus forming his own sort of awareness. He becomes a legit AI who, because he is then tied to the computers of the Enterprise, he can manipulate the ship and threaten it and, such like that. He becomes a tried and true villain to be thwarted by Data and LaForge because the very ship is endangered after they just run out of, conceivable adversaries that could be on par with Data. And so I was really captivated by the sort of time and place setting, the very Victorian London aesthetics and such like that. And that was really one of the first introductions that I had as far as, becoming loosely aware of what Sherlock Holmes was. And of course, being a comic book fan, I had run into several sort of associations and comparisons between Batman the detective, the Dark Knight detective, and the detective that was Sherlock Holmes. And but my love and fascination really hit its pinnacle and turning point in the early 2000s, between 2000 and 2002, I want to say, with the Hallmark-produced Matt Frewer starring Sherlock Holmes feature films. These were, Hallmark Channel TV movies, and they were done sort of not really adhering to canon, to the picture of Sherlock Holmes as he is represented in the stories and such like that. But they were sort of loosely adapted and much more comical, which was complemented by Matt Frewer, the actor, who I was, very much familiar with prior to that as Max Headroom, as well as from comedy films like National Lampoon's Senior Trip. And he had actually been in Star Trek The Next Generation in a time travel-y episode. And so I was very impressed with him, and I just was enamored with these Sherlock Holmes movies, because at that point I had never really wrapped my mind around the idea that Sherlock Holmes, the character, I always thought he was meant to be stoic and stuffy, and that there was no real joy or comedy to be garnered out of those stories, and boy was I wrong. At least in these adaptations, it was very comedic, and Sherlock Holmes was sort of portrayed by Matt Frewer as bumbling and oafish and being very prideful, but not always being correct and everything like that. So it would come to be, something that I would see as being not quite an exact representation of the character of Sherlock Holmes, but it was enough for me to really whet my appetite and want to actually delve into the canon. And the first volume I ever read, and this is going to kind of get a little show and tell, here, but was this volume. And I've talked about my passion and love with Sherlock Holmes and the canon and all of my, familiarity with all these kinds of things. I've already done a video back in 2011, which I will link in the description of this video, and I show some of the various volumes and refer back to, like, you know, the televised versions that I've encountered and references and the films and everything like that. But I showcase this particular volume, and you can maybe make it out a little bit on, yeah, you can see it right there, Sherlock Holmes Detective Stories, Doyle. And this volume actually comprises more than just Sherlock Holmes stories, but mysteries and other such works. And this was really the first volume that I ever read. I want to say circa 2002, 2003-ish. After having this loose familiarity with Sherlock Holmes as a character, with his contributions to popular culture and his references in Star Trek. There were also references in a couple of the Star Trek feature films. I believe there was a reference or two maybe in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, but most specifically Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, which was written by Nicholas Meyer, written and directed by, and he purposely put in there a couple of Sherlock Holmes references, he being a big-time Sherlock Holmes fan, a Sherlockian, tried and true, and he actually wrote some subsequent volumes as well, one of which was made into a movie in the 70s, and that is The 7% Solution. There are 3 books written by Nicholas Meyer, and I have all 3 of them. This being the first, which, as I say, was made into a movie. I've since seen the movie, and I've watched it several times because it's just damn good. Alan Arkin is in it. And I read this twice. I've also read the subsequent books that were released, The West End Horror, as well as The Canary Trainer. And in each of these books, it's really interesting who Sherlock Holmes runs into. Sigmund Freud in 7% Solution, and Bram Stoker in one of the other volumes. And it's just, what I really loved about the 7% Solution, for those who may be loosely familiar with the history of the real world, you know, implications of the end of Sherlock Holmes, there was a time where Conan Doyle, Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator and originator of Sherlock Holmes, had wanted to lay his character waste because he was kind of getting, you know, frustrated by the fact that this character was suddenly towering over him and gaining more acclaim than he himself, the author, and such like that. And it perturbed him, and he wanted to silence the character once and for all. So he had, tentatively speaking, attempted to kill the character off in a, you know, a match pitted between he and his arch nemesis, Professor Moriarty. And so eventually he would be roused by public outcry, as well as the outcry of his own mother. Arthur Conan Doyle's own mother told him, bring this character back. He is beloved. He is intriguing and everything like that. So he was motivated to bring Sherlock Holmes back. And there was some, you know, sort of fan outcry about how Sherlock Holmes was brought back, the story not being as fulfilling and not being as believable. And what, you know, Nicholas Meyer ended up being able to achieve with the 7% Solution was an alternate reasoning, an alternate history that happened regarding Sherlock Holmes during those months, those weeks, whatever it was, where the character was, you know, presumably killed off. He was actually experiencing something else entirely than what Conan Doyle would write in his return, and what the character of Sherlock Holmes would reveal he had been going through to his tried and true chronicler, you know, Dr. John Watson. This entire story offers up an alternative to what Sherlock Holmes was actually getting up to after his fateful encounter with Professor Moriarty, and it does so creatively that I just absolutely love it. It plays very much into the character of Sherlock Holmes having a cocaine addiction. And this story explores how he gets to move beyond that, because there would become a point in the stories, the original canon, where Arthur Conan Doyle would not reference back to this, you know, in subsequent stories after bringing the character back. And so what Nicholas Meyer very creatively did with the 7% Solution was offer up a reasoning as to why that disappeared, with the help of his chronicler, John H. Watson, as well as Sigmund Freud, who he meets in the story. And it's just really, really creative and intriguing. And so after I had delved into this first volume, and I'll go ahead and actually tell you what the first stories were that I ever read. It starts with the very first one, A Study in Scarlet, both parts 1 and 2, as well as The Ring of Thoth, A Scandal in Bohemia, A Case of Identity. And then there are some other, you know, stories that are included in this volume that are not Sherlock Holmes mysteries, but are mysteries just the same. And so this was the book that started it all. Very literally, I want to say 2002, 2003-ish. I sat down and I started reading them after being captivated by the character of Sherlock Holmes as he was portrayed in the Matt Frewer Hallmark TV movies. And once I became obsessed with the literary Sherlock Holmes, I had been perusing my local Books-A-Million or Barnes & Noble bookstore, and I happened upon this volume. This is the complete Sherlock Holmes, every single story as penned by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the novellas as well as the full-length novels, and I just pored over this thing. I have since read every story in this book twice, and a few select stories I've read 3 and 4, 5, and 6 times, especially my favorites. And for anyone sort of starting out, you know, in my 2011 video talking about my Sherlockian fandom, I had said my top 3 stories. I had basically talked about them as recommendations for anyone who wanted to get into Sherlock Holmes stories and actually read the originals. My 3 favorites at the time as I listed them, and still are very much favorites of mine to this day, include The Speckled Band, The Dancing Men, and The Copper Beeches. Those are the 3 signature stories that are my favorites among them. And I think, you know, The Dancing Men was one of Arthur Conan Doyle's own favorites of his works. Subsequent to that, I also, in my fandom of Sherlock Holmes, I had stumbled across this book, The Bedside Bathtub and Armchair Companion to Sherlock Holmes. This is another volume that I discussed briefly in my 2011 Sherlockian fandom video that I did. But this is a great companion piece in that it offers up, you know, sort of synopses of all of the original canon stories, as well as anecdotal information and inconsistencies in the story, because Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, you know, some of these stories he wrote very loosely, and the interconnectivity of details doesn't always mesh up. You know, even down to, at one point, Watson's wife calls him by the wrong name. Rather than John, she calls him James, I believe, in a story. And so this chronicles a lot of that sort of informational stuff, but in a very tongue-in-cheek, fun way. And it was a book I had to have as a Sherlockian, you know, fan of the canon. And apart from that, I would get into a lot of the, you know, sort of TV movies and such. In my 2011 video, I had talked about the I think it was a USA Channel produced TV movie called Case of Evil with James D'Arcy as Sherlock, sort of burgeoning into his career, one of his first cases, dealing with Professor Moriarty as played by Vincent D'Onofrio, which I thought was a coup in casting. Brilliant, brilliant casting, and was a very intriguing movie, not to be confused with being sort of directly adapted from any of the stories, but it was a singular sort of adaptation of the character. There was the Grenada Jeremy Brett series, which I had owned a lot of on DVD at one time. I had to sell them all off, and eventually I would get the first volume, the first sort of series again, which I still have to this day. And these were much more taken straight from the page, you know, adapted. The scripts were written around the stories as they were originally written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and play acted just expertly by Jeremy Brett. He's one of the best, if not the best, on-screen personas embodying, you know, the character of Sherlock Holmes. And there would be 2 subsequent actors who would go on to play Watson in that series. And then there was like the Case of the Silk Stocking with Rupert Everett. Somewhat in the vein was Rupert Everett's characterization, his performance of Sherlock Holmes, calling back to the Jeremy Brett Grenada series. It kind of felt like a natural outcropping from that, almost like an alternate story. And such like that, you know, as well as the Robert Downey Jr., Jude Law films, you know, which, again, they were not adapted directly from the works. They were kind of original stories, the first and second movies. And these were all fantastic, and for the longest time I had not gotten around to the BBC series with Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman, Sherlock. And it was through the intervention of several of my friends that I made online that I had DVDs of Series 1 and 2 and 3 sent to me and such like that, so that I could watch them and could peruse them. And they were fantastic. They were spectacular. I have done reviews of every single episode. I think I did of the first and second series a sort of comprehensive overview review of each of the episodes. And then subsequent to that, for each series, I did episode by episode singular reviews and discussions. And in 2015, I actually did an unboxing video of a gift from a longtime friend and follower, Dana, who had sent me the Sherlock Chronicles book, another one of my favorites. I've read through this in its entirety, and was actually paging through it again recently in building up to wanting to do this video, which chronicles a lot of behind-the-scenes information about the creation of the Sherlock BBC series. And these are just a few of the things that really contributed to my long-standing Sherlockian fandom. What burgeoned in childhood as a passing pop culture reference, a familiar silhouette of a character, would become much more a subject of my intrigue and fascination through its references in Star Trek and Star Trek: The Next Generation, and would finally reach the pinnacle, the turning point, during the early 2000s with those Matt Frewer Hallmark Channel, TV movies, for me to really want to invest myself, because I already knew I had a volume of collected Arthur Conan Doyle original Sherlock Holmes stories, and I poured through this during 2002 or 2003, whenever it was, after having seen those films. And so, as I say, this is the point in the video where I ask you once again. You can send me video responses or lengthy comments, whatever you want to say to contribute to this discussion. But as I say, what got you into Sherlock Holmes? And so yeah, otherwise it'll be pretty much it for me on this. If this video finds you well, and I'll catch you all later. Peace.